All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's book, The Crises of the Republic, and we are in the midst of her essay, Civil Disobedience. We talked about it last week, and I thought we had a really great conversation. Um, During the conversation and then after, we had a question, a really great question, um, from Burma about a letter that Mary McCarthy had written to Hannah Arendt shortly after this essay came out. McCarthy had seen an earlier version of it when they were in Italy, and then had given her some comments on it. And when it came out, she said, "Look, I like it better than the original version, but I still don't like it. Um, of all your essays, this is one of the essays that I don't really like." Um, and and um, you know, criticized it, which is what friends should do if they don't like their essays. And McCarthy's critique uh goes to the heart of what we talked about last week in part one, right? Which is that for Arendt, civil disobedience is a political act. It's not a moral or conscientious act. She wants to distinguish it from the Thoreauian, I wash my hands, right? My job is not to change the world, it's just to clean my conscience. For Arendt, civil disobedience is not about conscience. It's not a moral act. It's about um, it's about a political group, an organized minority that dissents from democratically legitimate actions. And McCarthy, says to Arendt, "Look, what you're saying flies in the face of common sense." And this is actually a long running conversation in the letters between Arendt and McCarthy about common sense, and they both think of themselves as common sense thinkers. And it's one of the things I love about Arendt and McCarthy is, they're interested in common sense. Um and 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 McCarthy says, look, our models for civil disobedience are Socrates, who chose to die for his convictions, and Thoreau, who preferred prison to paying a poll tax, supporting an unjust government for slavery, and Gandhi, who would rather starve himself than support unjust colonial rule. And McCarthy says, just like all of these people, the civil disobedience in the 1960s are conscientious people who are upset about the war in Vietnam because it's an illegal and unjust war. They're upset about Jim Crow, and they're upset about racism. Um, and she's saying, I think you're wrong, Hannah, right? That To say that this is not about conscience. Um, and I think that it's an important point. But McCarthy also, I think there's two things. One is, I think McCarthy, I think Arendt would agree to some extent with McCarthy, right? That it is about conscience on an individual level, right? Each individual who engages in civil disobedience may act out of conscience, right? And they may act out of a sense of strong individual affront at what the government is doing or about what another group is doing. Um, so I don't think Arendt is disagreeing with that. What she's saying, however, um, is that in a secular plural republic, right? For me to say I'm not going to follow the law because of conscience is supremely dangerous because everyone has a conscience. And in a secular republic where you don't have everyone following the rule of some theocratic elite, um, the civil disobedience may be motivated to act out of one conscience, right? But someone else may be motivated to act out of another conscience, right? Which is that, so the problem here is that one conscience acts against another. And so for conscience really is something that belongs to the inner dialogue of the self with itself. Um, Politics is different for Arendt, right? Politics begins and belongs in the public world of plurality. And once civil disobedience is in a secular world, in a world without clear truths, it has to be political rather than moral. It can't be grounded in inviolable authorities of conscience. Um, Conscience speaks in the singular, right? Politics exists in the plural. And if civil disobedience were to rest on conscience, Arendt says, then the question is whose conscience prevails, and we're back in civil war. And so that's, I think, the radical force of Arendt's argument that we talked about last week. But I thought Burma really did a good job of bringing out this problem, and forcing us to understand that, look, Arendt's um, argument is radical, and it's radical because of Arendt's understanding of plurality and her refusal of the idea that politics can be about conscience in our world. Um, and as I think I said in our discussion last week, it's radical because what that means is, while justice is something that obviously Arendt thinks is important, social justice, right? The idea that we should actualize justice in the world is for Arendt um, um, a limited endeavor, right? Yes, we should politically argue for justice, but politically, that means understanding that our idea of justice and someone else's idea of justice may not be the same. And in politics, to enforce our idea of justice on other people's idea of justice is tyranny. I mean, this is something that is just so fundamental to Arendt that I think that is not grappled with, right? Arendt does not believe in progress. It is one of the constant bugaboos in her writing, right? She does not believe that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. And that is something anyone who wants to read Arendt and take her seriously at least has to grapple with. You don't have to agree with her, but you got to grapple with it. She doesn't believe it. For her, justice is not about imposing my conscience on others. It's about creating a political system, a spirit of the laws, which we're going to get into in a second, that preserves liberty, liberty of conscience, liberty of religion, liberty of opinion, liberty of speech, of minorities over and against majorities. Justice is about liberty for Arendt, and liberty means that we have to limit the liberty of the majority and the limit of those who would impose whatever view of justice they have in order to protect the liberty of the minority. Justice is for her a kind of political pluralism, um, and that is a very difficult thing for, I think, a lot of people today to accept. And it's one of the reasons I find her so provocative and such an interesting person to teach and read. Um, Mark Carthy says to Arendt, I think you're wrong. I disagree. And what I tried to write about in the Amor Mundi column last week, right, was, I think when we ask these questions often of someone like Arendt, are you right or wrong? We get it wrong, right? She's a provocative thinker. She makes us think. Um, I think that, some people may agree with her, some people may disagree with her. It's not that she's wrong or right. You can disagree with her, you can agree with her. But she's forcing us, if we take her seriously, to consider the dangers of making politics about morality, right? And we're going to get into this in a second in part 3 when we move into it. But to me, this is one of the one of the dominant mistakes of modern politics, right? We have moralized politics so that people who we disagree with are not people we disagree with, they're evil or they're wrong. Um, I've written about this in a number of places, including an essay on politics and protest. But the basic argument that I'm making here is that if you're a political thinker, right, you don't think ethics belongs in politics. You don't think conscience belongs in politics. It doesn't mean we don't give up on ethics. Doesn't mean we give up on justice. Doesn't mean we give up on conscience. But they are not political ideas. They're personal ideas. They're individual ideas. And when we but if you're a political thinker, right, you have to accept a much more radical idea of plurality. And that's what I think in many ways is so brilliant about this essay. Again, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. So as we try and move into part 3 of this essay, right? Arendt is going to make an argument here, right? That, okay, civil disobedience is political, and it's a political movement of organized minorities, right, to oppose legitimate electoral majorities. Well, she says this raises some pretty serious questions, right? Of, well, shouldn't we obey the law, right? And why should we, you know, be able to break the law, not out of conscience, but politically, if the whole point of politics in a democracy is that the majority is right, has a right to govern. And I'm gonna take us through it step by step, but I just want us to know her ultimate argument, right, is that the reason that we're allowed to break the law is not out of conscience. It's because there is, in the American legal system, in the spirit of American law, and she wants to say, look, this is not true for every country. She's very Montesquieuian here, right? Every country has its own laws and its own spirit of the laws. And Montesquieu, says that there are, in republics, you have virtue as the principle of your law, and in monarchies, you have honor as the principle of your law, and in uh, tyrannies or despotisms, you have fear as the principle of your law. She goes, in the American constitutional republic, it's none of those, right? Consent is the spirit of the law. And by consent, she means the active support and continuing participation. Consent for her means that Americans see themselves as a plurality of people who are different, with different religions, different backgrounds, no common, they come from all over the world, and they don't try and unite into a union sacrée, a sacred union, right? So if you've read her book on revolution, which we actually just read prior to this in this reading group, she wants to argue that the mistake the French made was trying to say that the people of France have to have one opinion. Whereas the Americans said, no, we're going to be an a pluribus unum, out of many one, but a one that respects plurality and respects not only individual plurality, but communal plurality. The states can be different, right? And religious groups can be different, and towns can be different. And we have what she calls restricted autonomy of groups of minorities. And she says, if you understand the fundamental idea of American law based in consent as a consent of a plural people, then you understand that in America, in a way that almost no other country shares, again, this is her opinion, right? Consent implies dissent, and not individual dissent, but collective dissent. And if consent implies collective dissent, right, then dissent And when you collectively dissent, you then imply consent. It's a circle. And one who knows they may dissent collectively also knows that they somehow consent when they do not dissent. And this is her argument for how civil disobedience can fit into an American theory of law, which seems strange because it's saying break the law that's democratically enacted. And she's saying it's actually fundamentally coherent to the spirit of American law. And at the end of the whole essay, at the end of this last section, she's going to say that it actually is fundamental to the American constitutional structure because because as she understands the American fundamental constitutional structure, it denies sovereignty, right? For her, the great achievement of the American Constitution was federalist principle that all powers contest each other. You not only have the separation of powers on the federal level, but you also have separation of powers between the federal level and the states. What James Madison called the double security, right? This was James Madison's argument in Federalist 51, that the great innovation over and against the English Constitution was that the Americans created a double security, not just the separation of powers, but also the federalist system. And Arendt takes that seriously. And she says the problem is that the Supreme Court has abdicated its responsibility to prevent sovereignty through what's called the political questions doctrine. And we're not going to get too deeply into that now. If you want to ask questions about it later, we can. But basically what it says is the court is not going to interfere with squabbles between the executive and the legislative branch. And as a result, if one takes over the powers of the other, the court's not going to get involved in that. They have to fight it out amongst themselves. And if they don't, Arendt says the danger is, well, sovereignty and tyranny. And so she says we need an alternative to the Supreme Court, which has, in a sense, taken itself out of the fight. And she says it seems like the alternative is civil disobedience. And so she wants to make an argument that civil disobedience should actually be understood as a fundamental institution of the American Constitution. And as a result, as you see at the end, she calls for a constitutional amendment, creating in the Constitution itself the institution of civil disobedience as an alternative way to prevent or to seek to prevent one branch of government, either the executive or the legislative, primarily the executive, from becoming sovereign and taking on too much power. I sort of tried to offer what I take to be the overarching argument of this section, and I think it's, I mean, I've told you this is one of my favorite of her essays, contra Mary McCarthy, and I apologize to Mary McCarthy fans. But this is, for those of, I teach constitutional law, I have a law degree, some of you know, this is core to Arendt's understanding of constitutionalism. And it's one of the most, it's in a sense an addendum to chapters 4 and 5 of On Revolution. And one could read chapters 4 and 5 of On Revolution plus this essay as one of the greatest constitutional thinkings and theories ever offered. Again, that doesn't mean it's right, but it's extraordinary. Okay. Just to take us through the essay bit by bit so that you have a sense of how it works. It begins with this idea that we end part 2 with of the essay, where she says that change is here to stay, right? And things are changing faster and faster. And she says there's a problem, right? Because if change is going to happen faster and faster because we're living in this more technological age and everything happens faster and generations go faster and faster, change threatens liberty. I mean, this is just so obvious, right? If things are changing and a democratic majority wants to incorporate those changes into law, it can do so even if not everybody has changed, right? I mean, think about the abortion issue in the United States, or civil rights in the United States, or immigration in the United States, right? Just three mildly controversial issues in which either through democratic means or through bureaucratic means or through legal means, we legalized changes in the way we do things in the abortion laws, in the civil rights laws, in the immigration laws, before there was a real societal consensus. And what she's saying is, as change speeds up, there will be an incentive for many to try and impose their vision of the new idea, their new idea of justice, what's right, as law. But many others, and not individuals, but large minorities, will experience those changes as tyranny. And she says this could lead to civil war and it could lead to revolution. But the question really is, how do you survive the onslaught of changes that are going to come in our new technological world and somehow preserve liberty? And her answer is going to be civil disobedience. Or she's going to say that civil disobedience is one potential answer to the question of how, in a time of accelerated change, aggregates, organized minorities can remain protected and liberty can be preserved over and against who would impose their change through either democratic, bureaucratic, or legal means. And so she says, given that, if civil disobedience is going to become an important part of our world as a fail-safe for tyranny, right? Is civil disobedience compatible with law, right? And this is the question I was also talking about before. And she says, well, you have to ask it not in general, but in, is civil disobedience compatible with American law? And she thinks that even though civil disobedience is somewhat of a global phenomenon, there's only a word for it in English. Again, I'm not sure she's right about this, but it's a claim she makes. I'd be loved to hear if there's people on the call who have other ideas of languages that have the theory in it. And she says what we have to do is develop a specifically American idea of civil disobedience, not a theory, but out of what she calls the extraordinary experiences of the early colonists. And so the third point that I'm going to make is that she doesn't base this idea of law that will support civil disobedience in a kind of Kantian or Rousseauian autonomy where we give the law to ourselves, or Rousseauian squaring the circle where we're free and legislating at the same time. Right? She says that's based on conscience, the relation between me and myself. That's a moral view of law, not a political one. So we put that to the side. She says that we can't base it on social contract because many have lost faith in the Constitution, whether it's because the Constitution is seen as a male constitution or a slave constitution or a white constitution or a Christian constitution, right? And because people have lost faith in the Constitution because we haven't enforced it in the 14th Amendment. And so she says, you know, there's going to be many people, especially Black Americans, who don't see the Constitution as their Constitution, right? I mean, this is what's going to lead her to say that one of the great failures of the civil rights, of the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and up until when she's writing, and I guess even up until now, is that she says, we've never taken seriously that the American Constitution wasn't written for Black people, right? Now, there are people who disagree with her, like Frederick Douglass says, actually, I can read the Constitution and say that it's actually written for Black people. And he makes that argument, right? But it's a minority argument. But she makes this argument, and she says, more so than the Equal Rights Amendment, right, which says that women have equal rights, what we really need and what we should fight for is an explicit amendment welcoming Black people into the American polity. She says they were excluded. They were never part of it, and they should be brought into it. And so she then returns to this question of what is the citizen's moral obligation in a society of consent. And again, she says, well, I'm not talking about a consent in a biblical sense, right? Where the law is revealed by God and I have to obey because I believe in God. That's not the world we're in. She says, I'm not talking about consent in the Hobbesian idea of the social contract in which each individual concludes an agreement with a Leviathan to ensure his safety, right? That's what she calls the vertical idea of the Constitution. But she says, I'm talking about consent in the horizontal sense, which she here refers to in Locke, where people give up rights not to a Leviathan, to a government above them, but they make a mutual promise to the people around them, to their society. And they contract and they say, we are a people before we have a government. And as a people, we can then contract with each other to bind ourselves together, not to a Leviathan, but to a government that we in some sense still control, and we can always dissolve if it ever violates the terms of our giving it its power. And so in this sense, for her, in this horizontal sense, right, which she says has roots in the pre-revolutionary experience of colonial Americans, things like the Mayflower Compact, where people on the ship got together and said, we have the right to create a society and limit the powers of government. She says this kind of consent is based in active support, right? That people are actively engaged and continuing to participate in all matters of public interest. And this is what she thinks is the spirit of American law. It's helpful here, if you have the time, right, to go back and think about her discussion of On Revolution, of where she talks about how in the United States, the Constitution of Liberty, this is chapters 4 and 5, creates what she calls a new American experience and a new American concept of power, right? This is what she calls this horizontal consent, which was a power without sovereignty, without a Leviathan, without any absolute sovereignty, designed to preserve liberty and deserve power, and thus to deserve the people's potential to act. And this is the idea of consent that she's developing here. Now, she says consent is usually a fiction, right? But in America, dissent implies consent, right? This is her claim about the American spirit, that one who knows that he may dissent, especially as a group, not just as an individual, knows that when he doesn't dissent, he consents. And thus consent is implied in the right to dissent, just like dissent implies consent. And this is, she says, the quintessence of American law. She says one of the dangers, right, today is that our representative democracy is in crisis, right? This is again one of my favorite quotes of hers. She says representative government is in crisis today because we've lost this active participation. We've largely given up our active participation in government to bureaucracy and to political parties, right? But she says we never fully give it up, and it keeps coming back, right? And she says, look, in the 1960s, it looked like we'd given it up, and yet here it is coming back, and it's coming back in the form of civil disobedience. In the face of illegal war and an executive overreach and chronic deception and attacks on the First Amendment and the violation of the trust and the independence of universities, she says people took to the streets, not in violence, but in civil disobedience, as collective organized dissent. What they affirmed was plurality. What they affirmed was the right to association of plural people, right? Who are not part of a single American union, a unity, but an America in which people, even people who are in the minority, have collective power and collective rights. That in America we know, and what we care about is that democracy can become tyrannical, and we put all these fail safes and brakes against the tyranny of the majority. But when they fail, civil disobedience is actually a quintessentially American institutional response. Now, there's one important aspect of this that I want to end with, right? Which is that for her, civil disobedience is a continuation of voluntary associations. And what she loves about voluntary associations is they're practical. They're designed to prevent tyranny. They're not designed to impose one's own vision of justice on other people. They're a response to a state or a government or a group that would impose tyranny on others. And they seek to achieve actual goals to make people's lives better. And so she says the great problem, though, is that we lose this American idea of mutual action when our civil disobedience, when our collective action is no longer governed by actual goals, but is governed by ideology. If we substitute ideology, political or other, she says, for actual goals, if we substitute racism for treating people equally, if we substitute Bolshevism, right, for making sure people have enough to live on, if we substitute post-colonialism for a kind of pity for those who are, suffering, if we create an ideology that's no longer trying to actually help people, but actually wants to impose an ideology on society, we forget that the American spirit is actually about bringing together diverse and divergent minds rather than uniting the minds into one. And this, she thinks, is the great danger of many of the civil disobedience movements of the time. And I think she's right, and I think it's still the danger of many of the civil disobedience movements. She ends with this idea that the political questions doctrine in the court has in a sense neutered the Supreme Court as a way to prevent the executive power from taking too much sovereignty. And she says what we need is an alternative institutional space for the constitutional power for people to act together as organized minorities to resist the drive to tyranny. And she says civil disobedience is one, maybe the best way to do that, which is why we need a new amendment guaranteeing civil disobedience. All right. There's a lot in this essay. We've broken it up into two, and yet I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of it. But we have we have time to talk about it. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Remember, you can engage in the chat. Please keep the chat civil. Let's all make an effort to keep to facts and make arguments, but not attack individuals, whether they're here or not here. And let's then also engage in our version of real life with hands and voice. And feel free to go down to the react button, click on raise hand, and join the conversation that way. Look forward to it. Let's see. First up is Susan. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, but Susan. You have to unmute yourself, Susan.
Okay, this is the first time that I've spoken here.
Welcome. Happy
I'm
to have you.
rabbi in California. So my question is, I'm active with the indivisible movement, as I'm sure other people are, and going out into new kings. And it seems to me that the interaction now between indivisible and its allies and the regime, the Trump regime, is like a waiting to be an illustration of what you've just been talking about. Really fits in terms of the federalism, the checks and balances. I'm quite amazed at that. I'm wondering, without getting unduly into current politics to an extent that you don't want to do and isn't common practice with the group, I would just want to raise that, and I appreciate being called on. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. No, it's uh, welcome to the group, and you'll realize that while we try and welcome all politics here, we don't shy away from talking about politics. We just try and welcome diverse views. Um, my view on this is exactly, is yes and right. Uh, I mean, I've written a lot on this, and I think I've made it clear the um the current actions of civil disobedience, right? Around the country, whether I mean, Minneapolis was I think was an extraordinary example, but elsewhere as well. There are a lot of people acting conscientiously, right? But as a group, what you're seeing is people organizing. Not everyone has the same views. You're seeing, Christians and Jews and Muslims together, right? You're seeing black, white, and Hispanic and other people together. And people are organizing not because they all have the same conscience, but because they realize, as Arendt says, that there is a threat to the constitutional liberty and the prevention of absolute power in the country right now. And this is how Arendt sees civil disobedience. Now, we talked about this last week as well, but um, you know, I think it's also important to understand that over the last 20 years or 30 years, um, uh, many people in the country saw a kind of um, uh, change in the laws brought about by lawyers, judges, bureaucrats, administrators, um, that to them, right, was threatening their liberties and taking away their ability to live the way they saw as a part of a free America. And what you saw were movements like the Tea Party and even parts of MAGA movement, right? Um, which could also be seen as civil disobedient movements. Now, Arendt, we talked about this last week as well. The civil disobedience, as Arendt understands it, there are certain criteria. And one of the criteria is that you have to break the law openly, not in secret, right? You have to be willing to say, here's what I'm doing and why. And you can't use violence, right? And so obviously, to the extent that violence was inherent in it, the January 6th uh, events, I don't think qualify in the end as civil disobedience. But I think it is important to realize that um, what you've seen in the last 50 or 60 years of American history, since the 70s, let's say, um, is at different times on both sides of the political spectrum, civil disobedient movements arise in which people feel that their side, a minority or an organized minority, has been disempowered, whether by an elected majority or by unelected judges or bureaucrats. And what you're seeing are eruptions of this American spirit of voluntary association. Um, Obviously, some people like some of them more than others. Some of them are better organized than others. Some of them are more violent than others and less violent than others. And so all I'm saying is that from an Arendtian point of view, I think you're absolutely right that Indivisible and other organizations and many of these organizations who are resisting um, the the sort of weaponization of quasi legal, quasi governmental militias with masked people and not identify, which seem very opposed to any idea of a legal order, um, are I think very much civil disobedience in the Arendtian sense. But I think it's also important to realize that certain aspects of the um, Tea Party movement and even the Make America Healthy Again movement and some of these other movements are also organized minorities resisting what they consider to be unjust, uh, tyrannies of people who would impose their view of justice on them. So I think it's an important distinction. But thank you for joining us and welcome to the group. George, you got to unmute, George.
Yeah, I have a question about the vertical horizontal. In the Greek polis, social power is a vertical pyramid, but it's flattened at the top so that
Oh,
the
okay.
select have the power, and that power is horizontal. In the Rentian pyramid, the social pyramid remains the same, but the political is totally flattened. Whereas socially, there are all kinds of differences in power. Ideally, politically, as per citizen, there's a vote. The problem is that this is very manipulable. It's always been manipulated. It's still being manipulated. And even in her thing in dissent, I think this shows that unless the people at the top, there's at least 3.5% of dissenters who have political power, the dissent doesn't matter. So it's really the thing is that all the people below the political power or who actually have the political power don't count.
So George, I mean, I think you've confused two things. Let me just say, unless I'm not understanding your question, right? When she talks about social, when she talks about vertical and horizontal, um, she's not talking about elites and non-elites, right? She's not. This is not about like
I don't think that's right.
what?
I don't think that's right. I think she is talking about elites and non-elites.
No, I mean, by when she says what she means is that vertical consent uh, is a Hobbesian idea, right? In which all the people who are living in the state of war as individuals somehow immediately consent to some Leviathan who's now over them and will protect them and give them certain liberal liberties and protect them, right? Now, there's always the problem of how do these people who have nothing in common and are all at war with each other suddenly consent to this Leviathan? It's a fiction, it doesn't work. But but that's the horizontal, that's the vertical, right? When she says horizontal, what she means is there's first not we consent to a Leviathan. We all we start, we admit that none of us are just individuals. We're in families, we're in communities, we're in, we're in villages, we're in cities, and we all, walk down the street and we look at each other in the eyes and we shake hands and we open the doors for each other and we say thank you. And we build a kind of contract, not with someone who governs us, not a Leviathan, and not as individuals, but we create a society. And so social here is like societas in this sense. And and we build this society. And as we build the society and we have certain respect, we say, this is what we want. We want this. But how do we govern it? Right. And we say, well, we all know what we should do. It's right because we're in the society. But if someone breaks the rules, who are we going to? I can't enforce the rules myself because you can't be a judge in your own case. So we have to appoint some people to sort of govern for us, but they're not above us because we appoint them, and we can always take away their power to govern us if we think they govern us wrongly. So social for her, the horizontal mutual compact, what it signifies is simply that there's first a bond and bonds that happen without any government. And we only appoint a government not because we actually need the government to tell us what to do, because we know what to do, but because we're afraid of being judges in our own cases. And so Locke says we have to appoint this government, which we are above. It's not above us, in order to sort of administer the natural law that we all know in our society. That's very different from Hobbes. That's not about elites and everything. I mean, yeah, I hope that makes sense. And because I mean, I think that's a common maybe misconception. So thanks,
No,
Joe.
the only point I was making is if you look at let's say the AI moguls now, who have very high social power, they also have very high political power. She's separating the two for a reason that I don't understand.
Well, I mean, no doubt they have political power, but that's not what she's talking about here. I mean, this is about the social contract, right? This is not about power, political power in society. So that's not what I mean. Yeah, I don't think that anyone would disagree with you that you know, people who are wealthier today have political power, but that's not what she's talking about here. So thanks. Yeah, sorry. Lori.
Yeah, thanks. Um, I just like to bring your attention to the fact that in 1670, the UK, with its unwritten constitution, had an example of civil disobedience, which continues to this day, although the government's trying to roll it back. And bring up the issue of conscience, which I think,
Can you just tell me what you have in mind, Lori, so I know?
well, okay, trial by jury,
Ah,
part of the Magna Carta.
yeah.
In 1670, King Charles was put back on the throne, and there was a law that forbids religious gatherings of over 4 people. Quakers gathered over a few hundred. The preachers were thrown in jail. They were put before a jury, and the jury found them not guilty. The judge flipped out, put them in prison for the night without food and water. The next morning, they came back and confirmed their non-guilty verdict. The leader of the jury was fined. One of the preachers was William Penn, who then went to Pennsylvania. But the jurors used their conscience, and I believe that the U.S. has a similar. Can't jurors use their conscience to find a case? So your comments on Arendt were helpful there, because I think people's morality and conscience is clearly they bring it into their politics, but that is not the basis to form politics. But indirectly, it is. So
Thank you. Oh, is that it? Or do you have
but
another question?
that's really it. But I mean, the fact that so the conscience flows in indirectly,
Yeah.
although there's a law. But I would think that if that happens frequently, it's clear that the law is not seen to be legitimate, politically or democratically legitimate by the populace. And I would expect over time it would change, which again gets back to which shows the social push behind a law change.
Thank you. It's a good question. It's a great question. I actually was just teaching this week jury nullification, right? Which is what we in the United States call it when a jury simply ignores the law that it's told by the judge and decides according to its version of what's right against the judge. And it's a time-honored um, uh, idea here in the United States, as well as you said, in England. And I think you're absolutely right that the jury, in that sense, is one of the essential constitutional institutions that prevents tyranny in the United States. I mean, there's a reason that Alexis de Tocqueville said that jury is the most important institution in American democracy. We've seen that just in the last month in the United States, where, I mean, I think it's not wrong to say that the president has sought to politicize the judicial branch in a way that is fairly clear. And what you've seen is a number of grand juries, which almost always indict. I mean, it's very hard for a grand jury not to indict. A number of grand juries over the last month have refused to indict people that the Justice Department has sought to indict. We're not even talking about petty juries, right? Which have a lot more leeway in that regards than grand juries do. And, I think a lot of people are rightfully worried about the weaponization of the legal system. And I 100% think they should be. But what I always try and remind my profoundly pessimistic and despairing friends, which I can have too, by the way, is that the jury system makes it incredibly difficult in this country to prosecute innocent people. All you need is one juror, right? And we've all seen, 12 Angry Men and all these movies. And so the jury system is is one of the most important fail safes, and it can be an act of civil disobedience. Although, again, I want to be a little careful, right? Because I think Lori is right. The jury is less about politics and more about law or conscience. And in that sense, it's not a political, usually, if it's just one juror or two jurors, it's not a political movement. It's an act of conscience. And so it's more of a legal fail safe. Now, if what's happening now with the grand juries, which are, much bigger and are refusing to indict, one could think that actually is a response to a political movement. But I guess what I would say is that the juries are less about civil disobedience, as Arendt understands them, and a kind of, in this sense, moral, conscientious disobedience and legal disobedience. The last thing I'll say, Lori, is that you know, I'm not an expert in England, but my understanding is that England, along with any other place in the world that has traditionally used juries, has radically limited the applicability of jury trials. I mean, I haven't looked at it recently, but I used to teach this fairly well in law school many years ago, and my understanding is that most cases in the UK now do not have jury trials. Quite different in the United States, where the right to a jury trial is in the Constitution. And
Yeah, I mean the UK, I mean, is seeing the same push, but juries have found climate protesters non-guilty for, non-violent protests. So I would say that's civil disobedience that's, being solidified because the juries are finding them non-guilty, and they tried to name Palestine Support Action as a terrorist organization, and even 3 judges have come out and said that was unlawful. So anyhow, but okay, thanks.
thank you, Lori. Penny.
Hello, Roger, and everybody. Thanks for your time. When I was reading the civil disobedience chapters and also all the discussion we had about conscience and civil disobedience, I was thinking about an analogy which comes from philosophy of science. I thought the conscience as an individual hypothesis and civil disobedience like a scientific community. For example, hypothesis in science is proposed by individual or a small group of scientists or people. It is super subjective, although it could be very close to truth or anything in the physical world. Uh, Similarly, Arendt sees conscience is an individual moral claim. It is not politically binding, or it's not validated by uh, public deliberation. And on the other hand, based on my understanding, she sees civil disobedience as a scientific community. For example, if I want to talk about from Thomas Kuhn's perspective, knowledge emerges through collective validation. What counts as a problem is publicly structured. And we have three notions here we call normal science, in which we do scientific activity when there is no such anomalies or crises. But when we see there are some crises, we maybe change our paradigm. But there are difference between in a physical world, in a scientific activities, and in society. There is a difference, which is the power. For example, there are two groups of physicists who are working in different paradigms. They don't care about each other if how they see the physical world, but when we come to society, the power matters. For
Yeah.
example, one group of people can um, have a domination or can apply power to the other groups.
Yeah.
So, in a revolutionary times, this type of civil disobedience doesn't work. I'm talking about my country, my motherland, Iran. So we had lots of civil disobedience, and the anomalies are uh, emerged, and it is increasing, but it doesn't work in such a society. Yeah, this is my question.
Thank you, Penny. And welcome. Uh, yeah, I mean, really interesting points, and I'm not sure if the two go together. The scientific point and the Iranian point. They seem separate, or are they? Did you mean them to be connected?
Um, I see Iran as a society in which there are lots of crises. I call them anomalies, which we cannot be solved by civil disobedience anymore. We need paradigm shift.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the bravery of people protesting in Iran should be fundamentally acknowledged, and we should at least mention it. Um, uh, I also have great respect for the bravery of people engaging in civil disobedience in Minneapolis, right? Very clearly. And while two people have been killed in Minneapolis and another one or two shot or injured badly, and that's a tragedy. In the United States, when that happens, one hopes there will be investigations and criminal penalties. Again, we'll see. And I think this is part of Arendt's argument that civil disobedience is at home in the United States, because it's part of the traditions of the country. And it may be that there are countries, I think it's very likely that there are countries like Iran where right now it's not. And you do need, as you said, a paradigm shift if you're going to prevent sovereign, absolute, theocratic rule. And I think you're absolutely right. Um, on the question of civil disobedience and scientific community, I found that a really productive question, one that I'm not sure I'm able to answer fully right now. Um, I think and I think it somewhat depends on the kind of science you're doing, right? And it goes to what we would call in the world of academia or science peer review. Um, and it also goes to what Jonathan Rauch in his book, The Constitution of Knowledge, um, calls the sort of the use of anonymous blind tested reviews from many different biased people all over the world that check each other's work and come up with a kind of true science. Um, I mean, part of the problem we're having in the scientific world right now is that people have lost faith in the constitution of knowledge and in peer review. I mean, certainly in my field, um, I think there's a pretty widespread idea that peer review is an absolutely corrupt and unhelpful process. Um, uh, um, and because for the most part, people uh, don't have strong senses of what's true or untrue in the social sciences of the humanity, or they impose their view of it and just say you can't publish this because I think it's bad because I disagree with it. Um, and even in the sciences, I think there's a challenge to peer review. I mean, you're seeing this in most obviously the environmentalist debate, um, where and even also in the COVID and vaccine debates, right? Where um, uh, well-known, respected, accredited scientists are having their work isolated or rejected because people find it dangerous and wrong. And there's a question of whether that's uh, um, meaningful peer review or corrupt peer review. And so the idea of civil disobedience in the scientific community is fascinating because I think what you're seeing, right? And I think, in two subsets of the current administration in the United States, whether it's environmental science or uh, health and the Make America Healthy Again movement, right? What you see are organized minorities of scientists and public people who are supporting those scientists rebelling against um, what has been the consensus science um, for a certain amount of time on environment and on the use of vaccines or health or other things. Um, and there's a real debate about this. Now, the question is, should science be about politics? Should scientists be about organized minorities who resist the majority? Um, and I think it somewhat depends on whether the majority is scientific or political. And that's the challenge that I think your question brings up, Penny. And like I said, I don't think I have a full answer to it. I don't know enough about all of this right now, about the environmental science or about the vaccine science to say. I mean, I generally support, I've generally thought that the scientists arguing that we're in global warming and that it's leading to problems have been honest and right. But I do realize that some of those scientists have verifiably made false claims and tried to suppress research that wasn't common to them, and not sure exactly how important that is or what that means. And I do know that some very good epidemiologists have been suppressed in during the COVID debate and other things. And I'm just not always qualified enough to say, but I do think you raise interesting questions, and one could try and raise this. Ostensibly in a scientific debate, right? You shouldn't have questions of civil disobedience because it should be done through science, not politics. The question is to what extent that's possible today. So thanks, Penny. Steve.
Well, I'll jump on that, even though I've got another question. But I would suggest that science is related to politics in the same way that conscience is. Politics determines a range of policies. Which one are we going to follow? Conscience is one factor that an individual has in deciding whether or not to support, which policy to support. And the same is going to be true of science. You take, because as Arendt has argued in one of the previous books, facts, politics is about opinions, science is about facts. And facts don't have strength in the public realm. Opinions do. But my question, though, for some different topic, Arendt suggests that we need an amendment to basically legalize civil disobedience. Would that not neuter civil disobedience? Because the power of civil disobedience is that a group is formed and the issue is important enough to risk punishment of one sort or another, even and less in the United States and in Iran, life itself. And so that is that.
Yeah. It's a great question, Stephen, and it's one that I've struggled with in reading and writing about her essay, which I've written a lot about. I think when I started reading Hannah Arendt, right, and when I first read Civil Disobedience, I was taken aback. It's one of the things I love about Hannah Arendt is, she always, there's so many of her essays that when I first read them, I'm like, what? Really? And she makes me, challenge myself, right? And so I was taken aback when she said, it's wrong to think that civil disobedience, people who are civil disobedience, should be punished, right? She says, because they are breaking laws, but they're breaking laws openly and non-violently, and they're doing it in the name of legality and freedom and liberty. And so she wants to say, look, against the common sense and against the legal view, I'm a law, I have a law background, right? So against the view I was taught, right, that you have to take your punishment, and that's part of it. She wants to actually say no, right? Civil disobedience should be understood for what it is, a political act that when it's done non-violently and openly, and in a way that is civil in its total sense of the word, people shouldn't risk arrest. Now, is that right? Again, I don't know if it's right or not. I think it's fascinating. And I look at it now within the context of what's going on in Minneapolis, right? That's how I've been thinking about it. Along with Susie from the first question. And, do I think that the people who are blocking ICE should be arrested? And do I think that that's part of what it would mean for them to show their dedication, right? That's what I take to be your question, Steve. And my answer that I've been thinking a lot about it, and I don't know if I have a final answer on it because I think it's a complicated question, but my answer is no, I don't think they should be arrested, right? Now, if they violently attack of an ICE officer, yes, I think they should be arrested. But if they block roads and they do so openly and without masks and without violence and in a way of articulating an organized claim, and they don't do it forever, right? They're not sitting in Zuccotti Park for 7 months. They're doing it for a couple hours or a couple days or a certain amount of hours per day, as a way of expressing their organized minority opinion, I actually think they shouldn't be arrested. And I think it would be a problem if they were arrested. And I think that's where Arendt is coming from, is that if we're going to say that civil disobedience is such an important institutional um fail safe, we should actually not make it illegal. We should understand that it is a legal way of breaking the law in the name of the spirit of the laws. But there have to then be limits on it, right? And that's the question. It can't be forever. You can't block the roads forever. You can't use violence. You have to do it in a way that appeals to and shows your connection to the spirit of the laws and liberty and justice. So I understand that's controversial. It's controversial to me, right? I go back and forth on it. But I've sort of been convinced by her on that, I have to say. I mean, I look at the people in Minneapolis. Do I think that they should be arrested? And my answer is no, I don't, unless they go too far.
Yeah.
But I mean, you could disagree with me, and I would say, look, it's a valid point.
Well, I would suggest this. I don't think they should be arrested either, but that's my opinion. If I'm working for the state, then we have to arrest them because they're breaking the law. But that's what gives their action power.
Yeah.
But
I guess what Arendt is saying is there's a difference between someone who breaks the law because they want to get away with something.
Oh yeah.
And someone who breaks the law because they're making a political point. Mm-hmm. And she thinks that we should recognize that difference.
Well, there is one other thing. At the risk of sounding like a conservative, if you reward something, if you reward something or take punishment away, you'll get more of it. And the circumstances in the United States now is that civil disobedience is reserved for the in extremis violations of the trust, the authority we've given government.
That's right. And I think you have to reserve it for that. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think you have to reserve it for that. And she would agree with that too. She's not saying that anyone can just go and break the law for, it has to be a significant organized minority and she says with a quality of opinion, right? She has these things which are sometimes hard to parse. What does it mean to say a quality of opinion? Well, do the people in Minneapolis have the same quality of opinion as the the people who were the Tea Party people, right? Yeah. And you have to be able to make that articulation, but that's the way she would think about it. So yeah, it's not easy. There's no fine line, there's no bright lines, but that's how she would think about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Glenn.
Hi, Roger. For the record, a notable example of judicial review has intersected with our conversation. Yeah. Part 3 today, when your Supreme Court ruled that your president overstepped his authority by invoking emergency powers to impose tariffs. So would welcome any Arendtian take on that. But my question is that I want to understand better what she means or what she understands Tocqueville to mean on page 98 when she says in that key paragraph, it appears to me that an association is no longer capable or willing to unite, or when an association is no longer capable or willing to unite, quote, into one channel, the efforts of divergent minds, end quote, it has lost its gift for action. She put divergent into italics, or maybe she took that from Tocqueville. But what does she mean by divergent, or what does she mean by action? Because it occurs to me that there's a lot of action being undertaken by associations of non-divergent minds, and that uniformity of mind is actually a strength of the association or movement. Looking at you, Magga, where have I misstepped here? Where can I follow her thought again when it comes to the importance, when it comes to that assertion that you have to keep divergent minds together to preserve the gift of action.
So what she's saying here is that if you unite people all under an ideological commitment, right, whether that is a political or a racial or a religious ideology, right, then you don't have action, you have behavior. And so right, I talked a little bit about this in the opening. I don't know if you got to hear it, Glenn, or not,
I
but
was watching the hockey game, sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, much better than listening to me, so I appreciate that. Who
Oh, not
won?
saying that.
Yeah, don't tell us who won. But you seem happy, so I don't know. Um, the point is that for her, the civil disobedience, the organized minorities, right, and thus the voluntary associations that you're talking about here in Tocqueville, have to be organized around what she calls a little later down in the page, actual interest, as opposed to ideology. They can't be. They have to actually pursue an interest, like don't arrest my friends,
Oh,
right? Or um, uh, don't don't tell me I can't use certain words, right? Then, but if they go further than that and say, I'm not just interested in not arresting my friends. I want you to understand open borders as a, or I want you to understand that there, that that anyone can say anything and there's never a harm, and you go totally into like a strong ideology, right? Then she says, we're not actually trying to organize for actual needs and actually make people's lives better. We're not organizing people who are divergent minds who just think there's been an infringement upon the liberty of minorities. At that point, we're trying to impose a version of our justice on other people. And that's what she means by the substitution of ideological commitments for actual goals. And so she says what threatens the student movement, right, which is the chief civil disobedience group of the moment, is not just that it was used vandalism or violence or bad temper, right, but the growing infection of the movement with ideologies, Maoism, Castroism, Stalinism, Marxism, and the like. So, I think it's easier for us to understand that, today with certain of our political movements, right? It's one thing to argue against bombing people, whether in Gaza or somewhere else. And it's one thing to argue against acts of anti-Semitism, right? But it's another on both sides to argue that all Israelis are Zionists and guilty, and
right.
all Palestinians are innocent, or all times when Jews are in some sense, not privileged or something, that's anti-Semitism. The point is, if you radicalize it into an ideology as opposed to simply saying, no, we actually want to protect organized minorities and protect liberty, that's the problem that she's here trying to address. And that these movements that start as civil disobedience movements often too quickly and too easily get caught up in ideological commitments rather than actually trying to achieve meaningful goals that makes people's lives better. That's the claim here.
Thank you.
On the tariff issue, I about 20 minutes before game time here this morning, by that I mean the Arendt Center reading group, I happened to turn on my computer and see this. I started reading the first few pages of the Roberts opinion and the first few pages of the Gorsuch opinion. And so I have only I don't have a full thought out response to you. I do think it's interesting that you know the opinion was very much made on the grounds, the Gorsuch and Roberts opinion, so the majority and the concurring opinion, very much on the claim that the use of tariffs was an unjust extension, unjust claim of delegated powers from the Congress to the president, and thus, in some sense, was a matter of the executive taking power from the Congress. In some sense, no one, though, invoked the political questions doctrine, interestingly enough, and I think for
Right.
good reasons. But here is a case in which you rightly said the court is doing something that Arendt felt like it should do, which is serve as a check and barrier against the executive taking power from the legislative. And so I think from her perspective, this is something the court should do. So you're right.
Thanks again.
Yep. Vigdis.
Yeah, it's about this spirit of the Constitution as consensus. And as she says on page 88, one who knows that he may dissent knows also that he somehow consents when he does not dissent. And then on page 89 to 90, she talks about Tocqueville predicted almost 150 years ago that the most formidable of all the ills that threaten the future of the Union arises not from slavery, whose abolition he foresaw, but from the presence of a black population upon its territory. And the reason he could predict the future of Negroes and Indians for more than a century ahead lies in the simple and frightening fact that these people had never been included in the original consensus universalis of the American Republic. And she also says on page 99, we know the result and we need not be surprised at the present belated attempts to welcome the Negro population explicitly into the otherwise tacit consensus universalis of the nation are not trusted. And I wonder over this. I didn't know this actually about the Constitution, that they were not included. It doesn't surprise me though. But I wonder, how do you see this fact plays into what's going on today with the ICE, with the executive orders of that Trump gives out, and how we see a kind of white supremacy playing out in US? That was I wondered about that.
Okay. Thanks, Vigdis. So, I mentioned this in the opening, but it's good that you brought it up and put the language in front of us. So let's just say that this is one of those situations in which Arendt actually goes further than other people, right? In her reading of the racism of the country. Because while the Constitution never mentions slavery or slaves or black people or white people, it does have 4 provisions that were clearly meant to, at least for a time, preserve slavery, but never mentioning it, which is why Frederick Douglass, in his essay on the Constitution, makes the case that the Constitution is actually an anti-slave document, not a pro-slavery document. But Arendt, I think, largely makes her point here on the basis of the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, which is the infamous decision in which Chief Justice Roger Taney says that in the United States, black people can't be citizens. Now, the dissents in that case, I think makes the better constitutional argument. That's my own view. But there's no doubt that the Taney decision was the majority decision and thus set the constitutional precedent that black people couldn't be citizens of the United States. And Arendt says that if given that, right, what's needed is not just sort of a consensus that he was wrong, but an explicit amendment, constitutional amendment that says you're wrong. And I think it's a fascinating point. As far as I know, nobody has really ever taken this up as a political or legal activity. But I think it's one of those insights that is again provocative and I find meaningful. On to compare it to what's going on with Trump. I mean, you know, I it's a bit different, right? The attack. I mean, again, the attack on undocumented people in the United States is at once uh, um, a legal attack in some sense, in the sense that we do have legalization, immigration laws, and every president, including Obama, as we all know, deported millions of people during his presidency. Um, and I think you do. I think it is right for the country to be able to and to enforce its laws. And I think it's actually a bad thing for the country to have too many undocumented people in the country, because what it does is it creates a culture of lawlessness and in a sense secondary citizenship or non-citizenship status, where people can be abused and underpaid and endangered, and they create a kind of lawlessness in the country that I think is bad and dangerous for the country. Um, and so as a matter of law, right? I don't think there's a strong argument against trying to deport people, but the the way in which one goes about doing it, um, rounding people up, going into schools, the racialized way in which they're going about doing it, pulling people who speak Spanish or look foreign or other things like that, um, is in my view not only morally wrong, uh, and not only unneighborly, uh, and anti-American, but it's a political disaster, and um and it's dangerous and disgusting. But I guess I don't see it as so I think there's a racialized element of it, but I think it's more in the how as opposed to um the general idea, which is that people should, come through legal means, which I don't think is necessarily a racialized idea itself, although it can be.
Thanks.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're out of time, Steve. I'm sorry about that. We're not meeting next week. We have a week, right? Yana, I believe we have a week off, and then we
Yes.
start with the first couple of sections of On Violence, another great essay.
The first one, yes.
Only the first one?
Yes, and then
Yeah.
the second one the week after. March 6th is the
Right.
first one.
So March 6th, the first section of On Violence. I look forward to seeing you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you soon. Thanks very much.